G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Those of you who've ever read a Biggles book will recognise what you're looking at. Those of you who've ever pondered a Snoopy cartoon will probably recognise it as well. This is a Sopwith Camel. It's a brand new one with an actual rotary engine flying in the hands of Dodge Bailey. It belongs to the Shuttleworth collection, or it's operated by the Shuttleworth collection. I'm not certain about the paperwork. At Old Warden in England. Beautiful photograph. I've had a bit of a passionate fascination with Sopwith camels for 50 years myself. So, welcome to a Warbles series on camels. This is part one, which will be the Sopwith camel mystery, according to Captain Norman Macmillan, which will involve dipping into great aircraft. Which was liberated from the bottom of a cupboard in a classroom by a little Warbles who had read of camels in Biggles books. And it was quite possibly in 1969, rather than the date on the flyleaf, because that itself was written probably 5 years, 10 years after it was purloined. My thieving rationalisation at the time was that it was neglected and covered in dust in the bottom of the cupboard, and it was no longer part of the library's collection, so I was liberating it. We have 2 chapters on the camel. This video will consist of me pretty much reading the first chapter on the camel, popping firecracker to camera as illustrated by what materials come to hand, including Aeroplane Monthly, December 2017, some of which you've already seen. We'll dig into the family archives too. But here's the general plan. This video will look at the mystery of the camel by looking at chapter 5. Next video, we'll look at the structure of the camel with chapter 6, Ubiquitous Fighter. Third video, we'll look at the aerodynamic design of the camel and how that affected its handling when everything went right. And the fourth video, we will reveal what actually was wrong with the camel. Why, as the mystery has it, camels occasionally spun into the ground from low altitudes, from high altitudes, with trainees, with novices, with ordinary pilots, with experts. But anyway, now we know why the camel sometimes had a little tantrum and killed even the best camel jockeys. So we begin with popping the firecracker quote, which comes from Warbirds, written by Anonymous, which was actually written by Elliot White Springs. I'll begin with letting you look at this. As you can see, one of the quirks of this particular textbook, as I intimated on the title page, is this business with the bird silhouette, which is kind of charming in its own little way. And here's what it does say. NB, here, as in other drawings in this book, the outline of a 10-foot span albatross indicates the scale. like thus, and even as such. The Parnell Pixie, motorcycle of the sky. Okay, so while I'm reading this, you can feast your eyes on that for a bit. Popping firecracker. In 1917 and 1918, some pilots begged not to be posted to fly Camels, and some pupils found ways to be sent to flying training schools equipped with other types of aircraft, for the Camel was a tricky aeroplane to handle. Some pilots feared it. Its shrift was swift and dangerous to the ham-handed and slow-thinking. Yet in the hands of the man who had learned to ride this Mustang of the sky, there was no aeroplane of its time which afforded its master more delight. The writer of the Diary of an Unknown Aviator, published under the title of War Birds, was an American pilot who flew SE-5s in France. He wrote of his contemporary, Elliot White Springs, "He wants Cal and me to join his flight, and Fowler said he'd arrange it, but we said nothing doing. I don't want to fly Camels, and certainly not Clerget Camels. I told him I'd crown him eternally if he got me put on those popping firecrackers. My neck isn't worth much, but I want an even break." Unquote. Shortly before, he was himself shot down and killed by a German fighter 20 miles behind the German lines. This anonymous diarist added to his earlier remarks about the Camel these words: "That's one thing about a Camel. You've got to shoot down all the Huns to get home yourself. There's not a chance to run for it. These boys are lucky if they just get back." Unquote. True, the Camel was slower than the SE-5 or the Spad. It could not dive as fast as either of these stationary engine fighters, nor climb so high, but it shot down 1,294 enemy aircraft in the First World War, more than any other single type of aircraft. Of these, 908 were destroyed by the Royal Flying Corps Camel squadrons on the Western Front from their first re-equipment with Camels in July 1917 through the period after they were incorporated into the Royal Air Force on 1 April 1918 until the armistice on 11 November 1918. And one of those Camel squadrons was number 4 Squadron Australian Flying Corps, which also used the distinctive boomerang marking on its Sopwith Camels, illustrated as B7406 of Sea Flight. As it appeared in March 1918, this aircraft was delivered to the squadron on 25th of February 1918 by Lieutenant G. Jones. If Camel pilots could not run away, they had a wonderfully manoeuvrable gun platform in which to stay and fight it out. The Camel's weight was most compactly concentrated. Propeller, engine, guns, ammunition, fuel, pilot, undercarriage, and wings were crammed into fore and aft length of about 7 feet. There was not much legroom for a 6-footer pilot, but there were no spread out weights to make turns sluggish. This made the Camel supreme in the dogfight. It was the closest in-fighting fury that ever sat on another aircraft's tail, rivalled only, if at all, by the Fokker DR-1 triplane of the German Army Air Force. Its right-hand turn was the Camel's trump card. It turned left at about the same rate of turn as the German Albatross fighter, but it could complete 3 right-hand circles while the Albatross made 2. So, whenever a Camel pilot found himself hotly pursued, he promptly heeled over into a right-hand turn, shook off his opponent, and himself became the aggressor. The Camel pilot could rarely choose his combat. He had often to wait for the higher flying enemy to pounce, and so the choice of battle rested with the opponent. Yet once battle was joined, the Camel pilot could wrest the initiative from his foe. That is, if he had first mastered the art of flying the Camel. This little biplane in its standard form had a wingspan of 28 feet, an overall length of 18 3/4 feet, and was 9 feet in height. Both top and bottom wings had the same chord of 4.5 feet, but the top wing was staggered 18 inches forward of the lower wing, which improved the pilot's view forward and downward. Span-wise, the top wing was flat. The two lower planes each had 5 degrees of dihedral, upward sloping angle. The Camel was the first Sopwith, later Hawker, aeroplane with this distinctive feature of carrying all the dihedral on the lower wing. There was a gap of 5 feet between the top and bottom wings at their roots. The total wing area was 240 square feet, of which 46 square feet were in the 4 aileron surfaces. Going by the lump on top of the centre section, pretty sure that's a naval version of a Camel. Indeed, there's 2 of them. This photograph was posted back to his family in October 1918 by Les Wharton, standing there on the left side of the photo. In this photo, which he posted from Cairo on the 28th of August 1915, after he'd come off Gallipoli with a broken ankle. So he must have been recovering for a while when that photo was taken. And his mate there in the chair has what they call the 1,000-yard stare. He was obviously on Gallipoli for too long. So, Private Les Wharton in 1915, I think Corporal in 1916 when he got back to Australia, Sergeant when he got to France in 1917, military medalled, his choice of posting, and he went to the Australian Flying Corps Training Squadron on Salisbury Plain, sending back a photo of an Avro 504K, a different Avro 504K with him recognisably sitting in it, and the Sopwith pup in which he transitioned from Avros to single-seat fighters. Having come so far with this particular diversion, I'll put you out of your misery a bit. This is 4 Squadron in March 1918. However, Uncle Les didn't get there in March. It wasn't until, by all accounts, Les Wharton was a bit of a fire eater, if that makes sense. 4 or 5 months on Gallipoli, promoted, military cross and a military medal and a promotion in France. He actually captured about 500 yards of enemy trench. So it's probably not surprising that he made the history books with his Sopwith Camel. With the opening of the final phase of the war in August, operations against the enemy were stepped up, but the considerable successes were offset by a series of casualties. One of the new pilots, Lieutenant L. Wharton, found himself separated from his companions on the 11th, but undaunted took on 2 LVG two-seaters. After sending one down, the Australian must have received the impression that the whole German air service was at his heels when half a dozen fighters shrieked down seeking revenge. With his Camel badly damaged and petrol pouring from holes in the tank behind his seat, Wharton sought safety in the clouds below. Unfortunately, after emerging from their shelter, he was wounded by anti-aircraft fire and crashed on the British side of the lines, later being invalided back to England. A few days later, Lieutenant S. Howard, who had joined the squadron with Wharton, was wounded during an attack on ground positions, along with Lieutenant R. G. Smallwood, and they also went to hospital. Lieutenant Eddles followed them after being hit on the 25th, but he was more fortunate than Wharton's replacement, Lieutenant P.S.K., who was killed on the 22nd as a result of another of the bad collisions which seemed to plague No. 4 Squadron. By now, the photos are showing Sopwith snipes. So, we'll go back to Macmillan. After this little diversion to pay due homage to my teenage devotion to the pterodactyl in the ancestral family tree. Well, the more martial of the two pterodactyls, actually. 3, perhaps. The tailplane spanned 8 feet and had 16.5 square feet of surface. Its incidence of 1.5 degrees was fixed, and the pilot had to counter any fore and aft variations by hand pressure on his control stick, through which he operated the 10.5 square feet of elevator. Normally the Camel was tail heavy in flight, and the pilot had to fly perpetually with the stick pressed forward until he entered some manoeuvre requiring rearward movement of the control column. This constant load on the hand and wrist made it harder still for the novice or the heavy-handed individual accurately to judge the fore and aft control movements needed to handle this sensitive mount in its most delicate axis. The pilot's left hand was usually occupied in adjusting the rotary engine's throttle and fine adjustment for fuel levers on the quadrant on the left side of the cockpit, leaving the right hand for all the other additional duties to the manipulation of the elevator and aileron controls. Among these were the loading of the guns for firing, curing gun jams, generally by the simple expedient of knocking home the cocking hammer with a 2-pound hammer when the breech was kept open by a thick rim or a faulty cartridge, pumping air pressure into the main petrol tank, making hand signals to other aircraft in the formation, firing very pistols as pyrotechnic signals, writing on a knee pad some detail noted during visual observation over the enemy area, putting the scrap of paper into the 5.5-inch by 4-inch fine woven lead weighted linen canvas message bag, snapping its 2 press fasteners together and throwing it overboard to fall to the ground reporting centre, trailing its 2 54-inch long and 4-inch wide coarse mesh linen streamers composed of equal lengths of blue, yellow and red visibility panels. But if one took the right hand off the light alloy shaped hand grip of the joystick for even a moment, the Camel instantly threw its head up in the first part of a loop. So if he needed his right hand elsewhere, the Camel pilot had to become adept at holding the weight of the stick with one or both knees, while simultaneously controlling the rudder bar with both feet. Flying a Camel was, in fact, a feat of juggling as much as of flying. Sometimes, indeed, a pilot would describe airing a Camel as juggling with death, an expression which was modified in the Second World War into dicing with death, or just, quote, dicey, unquote. The area of the fin was 2.25 square feet, of the rudder 5 square feet. The rudder was none too big to take over the functions of the powerful elevator in steep turns. This somewhat uncoordinated control feature of the aircraft made it both difficult to fly and contributed to its ready tendency to spin. The 9-cylinder air-cooled Clerget rotary engine, shown here on the left, mounted its 8-foot 6-inch 2-blade wood propeller on the crankcase extension, and both spun around clockwise when viewed from the cockpit. At full throttle, the engine turned at about 1,250 to 1,300 revolutions per minute when flying level. In the rotary engine, only the crankshaft was stationary. All the other parts of the engine, cylinders, valves, pistons, connecting rods, induction pipes and crankcase, revolved, and the rotating mass of the revolving engine and air screw created a considerable gyroscopic effect on a relatively light aircraft such as a Camel, which weighed only some 1,450 pounds fully laden. These gyroscopic forces resisted the execution of some manoeuvres, but aided others. When turning steeply to the left, the Camel's nose rose, and when turned steeply to the right, it was forced down. In the left turn, the pilot had to apply bottom rudder to prevent the Camel from stalling, and in the right turn, he had to apply full top rudder to prevent it from falling into a spin. Whichever way he turned, he had to apply rudder with his left foot. The pull of the gyroscopic forces that forced the nose down increased the rate of turn to the right, and that fast turn was the undoing of the bad pilot. To execute it safely, full left rudder had to be applied quickly before the turn was fully developed. Once the nose had begun to drop, no margin of rudder control was left to bring it up again. The turn then had to be converted into a power spiral and started all over again after straightening out. Meanwhile, height was lost, and in a fight the loss of height and initiative in manoeuvre was only too often the fatal prelude that gave a skilled enemy pilot his own delectable opportunity to kill. Norman Macmillan was a bit of a bloodthirsty individual. Sometimes the wisest action then was to pull the stick hard back, apply right rudder and spin down away from the danger, feigning disablement. But that meant losing touch with one's formation and might result in the odds being heavily loaded against a lone camel. The one sure procedure was to learn how to tame that fierce little fighter so that it could never trick one, whatever the circumstance. And, barring accidents, it was possible to do so. Many of the most highly skilled pilots of their time were those who had learned much about flying from their temperamental camels. Captain D.V. Armstrong of 44 Home Defence Squadron was the outstanding stunt pilot of his day. Never was such flying seen before, nor after, because it was subsequently forbidden. He looped his camel from ground level at comparatively slow speed. He barrel rolled it, also almost at ground level, so that at least on one occasion spectators averred that a wingtip brushed the blades of the grass on the airfield as the aircraft rolled around. This barrel or flick roll is never or seldom seen now. Just as an aside from the Fool's Gallery, in 1960 when this book was written, yeah, might have been a correct statement. These days, 2020, the flicks or snap roll, which they used to call a barrel roll, it's very, very common at air shows. It's very, very common in aerobatic displays. Returning to Macmillan, this barrel or flick roll is never or seldom seen now, yet in 1917 and 1918 it was a common aerobatic manoeuvre. It was invented before the classic slow roll, which is the manoeuvre performed today, and which has outmoded the barrel roll. The barrel roll is in reality a high-speed horizontal spin. To understand the flight path of the aeroplane, hold a corkscrew horizontal. Then imagine an aeroplane travelling along an aerial pathway corresponding to the twisted metal in your hand. You will see that it must rise and fall in relation to the ground. During this motion, it is accidentally out of the pilot's control. He must deliberately put it out of control to enable it to perform this self-energized maneuver, then regain control again at its conclusion. It is, in fact, a form of aerial conjuring. When performed close to the ground, the slightest error of judgment in beginning or ending the auto-rotation could cause a crash, and the same result could spring from some incalculable eccentricity of behaviour of the aeroplane during its auto-rotation, so that a barrel or flick roll performed at low height is indeed a deliberate dicing with death. Moreover, the barrel roll imposes heavy stresses on the aircraft and produces unbalanced lifting forces along the wing spars because of the differing angles of lift from one wingtip to the other. The slow roll, which replaced the flick roll, is a fully controlled manoeuvre in which the aircraft is flown about its fore and aft axis, thus permitting the pilot to maintain level flight or climb, if he so wishes, quite as safely as in normal flight. But there was something about a camel which could elude even the greatest experts among pilots, apart from baffling tyros. Time after time, the camel would perform manoeuvres with identical results, but on the 10th or 20th, or perhaps the 50th time, it would behave differently. Then the incautious pilot who risked his neck too low would crash. Then even skill was of no avail, for the camel had defied its pilot. That was at once its danger and its lure to the man who delights in the fascinating pastime of deliberate self-exposure to calculated risk. Armstrong was one of these. Here comes a mistake by Macmillan. Not long before the armistice, he was killed when serving with 151 Squadron, which combated Gotha night bombers in France. He was killed on the 13th of November, 2 days after the armistice. His Camel spun into the ground. Today, when some service aircraft descend 5,000 feet in one turn of a spin, it is remarkable to recall that the Camel spun so rapidly for such small loss in height. Official spinning test reports, which I have consulted, state that the Camel lost 200 feet in one turn of a spin. But I myself found, when spinning at maximum rotational speed, that my Camel lost not more than 100 feet in one turn. Thus, when spinning, it was an extremely difficult target for an enemy pilot to hit. And yes, this is actually a photograph of Durban Victor Armstrong's Camel after it went splat. And in the fullness of the time, we will get back to that later. One instance of its great manoeuvrability occurred over Salisbury Plain. An advanced pupil was practicing ground target shooting on a rather blustery day. Following his instructions, he was quarter rolling at 1,000 feet into almost vertical dives aimed at a wood and canvas aeroplane plan-shaped target on the ground. As he fired his guns, his little mount was rocking in the windy eddies from a nearby wooded hill. In the entry to one dive, his Camel suddenly went right over on her back, stalled, and spun upside down. Two-seat trainer Camels had not then been produced, but that pupil had been instructed conscientiously on the methods of recovery from all kinds of spin on the Avro 504 trainer. Himself alone now, he had to apply this knowledge to the Camel in a game of life or death. There was a wide responsive difference of control between the fierce Camel and the Avro, and the pupil overcorrected. The Camel promptly changed from an inverted left-handed spin into a right-handed normal spin. Again the pupil corrected, and seeing the ground so much closer, tried to pull out too quickly, stalled again, and spun to the left. This time he calmly determined not to be foxed again. He made the correct movements for recovery and waited. Despite his closeness to the ground, he maintained the resulting dive until the Camel had gained enough speed to be restored to level flight again without stalling. As he curved out of that near-fatal dive, his wheels touched the ground and sent a small cloud of dust into the air. What aeroplane but the Camel could spin 3 times in 3 different ways between 1,000 feet on the ground and emerge undamaged, especially in the hands of a pupil? I wonder how hard the wheels hit the ground when it bounced off. What aeroplane but the Camel could spin 3 times in 3 different ways between 1,000 feet on the ground and emerge undamaged, especially in the hands of a pupil? None that one has ever heard of. No other aeroplane ever built could have rung the changes with such amazing speed. This was the very quality that made the Camel such an efficient fighting aeroplane. If you're not really into it, make a cup of coffee for the next 5 minutes, but I'm going to read the following because it fills in the background of the story and it opens the door on a really interesting little segue. I had never heard who designed the Camel. I searched through all the reference books. Although the Camel was never absent, none mentioned its designer. So I wrote and asked Sir Thomas Sopwith. In reply, he wrote that memory can play tricks in advancing years, but he felt sure the Camel was designed by himself, Sigrist, and Hawker. I later confirmed this from other sources. In 1916, these 3 men were leading figures in the Sopwith Aviation Company Limited, founded by Tommy Sopwith in 1913 at Kingston-on-Thames, southwest of London. They were a curiously assorted but gifted trio. Sopwith, tall, slim, suave and debonair, was a product of the English cultured classes, who early broke with tradition and trained as an engineer. At the age of 22, he became the 31st certificated British pilot on the 22nd of November 1910, and subsequently won many flying prizes, opened a flying school, taught many others to fly, started modifying and then began building aeroplanes at Brooklands before forming the manufacturing firm at Kingston. He is now, or was in 1960, chairman of an industrial empire. In 1909, how's this for a sidetrack? In 1909, Major V.W. Bill Eyre and T.O.M. Sopwith bought a 166-ton schooner, an old vessel into which they installed a 47-horsepower Thornycroft auxiliary engine. Bill was a first-class mechanic, and it was he who picked Fred Sigrist, who was then working on the bench at the Parsons Motor Company in Southampton, and offered him the job as chief and only engineer. Fred joined at 50 shillings a week. When Sopwith took up flying in the autumn of 1910, Sigrid went along with him as chief mechanic. He had the same job during the summer of 1911 when Sopwith was flying in America. Fred was so good that he was works manager all through the 1914-1918 war, and when Tommy Sopwith liquidated the original Sopwith Aviation Company shortly after that war, he, Fred Sigrist, and Harry Hawker started H.G. Hawker Engineering Company Limited as equal partners. Skilled-fingered, nimble-minded Fred Sigrist was never a pilot. Of average British height and spare figure, he never lost the hallmark of his humble accent, but his bright brown eyes always lit up when his wide mobile mouth curved into its ready, friendly smile. He, doubtless, contributed the practical touches to the Camel's structure. In the late 1930s, crippled with rheumatism, but with a big stake in Hawker Aircraft Limited, as the firm had then become, he retired to the sunshine of the Bahamas. I last met Fred outside the Royal Aero Club in Piccadilly during one of his periodic visits home. It was a bright July day shortly before the Second World War. Reflected heat was rising from the black bubbles oozing from the pitch-set wood blocks of the shimmering roadway. Get that? Wooden blocks set in pitch in the road in the 1930s in London. They still had wooden roads in London. The broad-leaved trees in the cooler green park opposite were draped with early summer verdure. Sigrist's always sallow face, drenched darker with tropic sunshine, was deeply lined from rheumatic pain. Yet the same brave, bright smile I had known many years before illumined his features when we met. He came less often to London later. On the 10th of December 1956, he died at Nassau on the income taxless tropical island, a millionaire, aged 72. Harry Hawker, attracted by aviation, came to England from Australia and was engaged as a mechanic at the Sopwith Flying School at Brooklands. There he was taught to fly by Fred Raynham and took his Royal Aero Club pilot certificate number 297 on the 17th of September 1912 in the same 50-horsepower gnome-engined Farman biplane on which Major H.M. Trenchard, DSO, and Captain E.L. Ellington, who were both destined to become chiefs of the air staff and marshals of the as yet unimagined Royal Air Force, took their respective certificates in August and October of that year. Hawker's slight figure was always dressed in the conventional mode of the period for men of his class, a lounge suit and a high double-fold starched white linen collar. On the flying field, he turned his cloth cap back to front, but there was nothing conventional about his flying. He quickly rose to the top in competitions and record-breaking flights, always in Sopwith aircraft. Recognising Hawker's courage and natural aptitude for flying, Sopwith appointed him in 1913 as the company's test pilot. With that appointment, Sopwith appears to have relinquished all flying himself. But almost from the start, Harry Hawker was struggling against ill health. His constitution could not easily withstand the rigorous conditions of flying in those early open cockpit aircraft. Time and again, this robbed him of successes that were within his grasp. Yet, despite his physical unfitness for active service, Hawker tested more prototypes during the First World War than any other pilot and flew many hundreds of production aeroplanes on routine test. In 1921, he entered for the aerial derby. His mount was a Newport Goshawk racing biplane, because the Sopwith Company had gone into voluntary liquidation in 1920, and the H.G. Hawker Engineering Company Limited, which arose in its place, had not yet got into its stride. He took off from Hendon Airfield on a practice flight 4 days before the race. Soon he was seen to be in trouble. From high over Burnt Oak, Hendon, he came spiralling down, seemingly with the intention of landing. Before he got down, the Goshawk was on fire. The aircraft fell, hit the ground, its petrol tank exploded. Hawker died instantaneously. His terribly fractured body lay 200 yards away. And that's English code for he jumped out before he hit the ground. When he died, he had tuberculosis of the spine. An operation might have extended his life briefly, but would have made him a cripple. He himself knew that his life must be forfeited soon to that dread disease, against which he had undauntedly fought to carve his name on the roll of fame as an airman. These were the three men responsible for the Camel's design. In a committee, their Camel was not the product of a sudden flash of genius. It was the great-great-grandchild of the original and notable 1913 Sopwith tabloid, derived through succeeding generations of aircraft, called the Sopwith Schneider and Baby floatplanes. The Sopwith SLT-BP biplane, built for Hawker's personal use, and the Sopwith Pup. All were single-seaters. The Camel was a modified version of the gentle Pup, and the end product of 3 years of continuous development of one basic type of aircraft by the same three men, whose ideas were translated into detailed working drawings by their chief draftsman, Mr. Ashfield, a former schoolmaster. It may have been because there was no one individual as designer that the docile Pup grew suddenly into the fierce dog who was incongruously named the Camel because he had a hump on his shoulders to cover the mechanism of the two Vickers machine guns that gave him his bark and bite. And there you see the hump, which either streamlines the gun's mechanisms, which doesn't look like it does, or it prevents the gun's mechanisms from freezing at high altitude by keeping the moving part warmer. And it might actually do that. The practice of naming aeroplanes was still rare when the firm's mechanics pushed the prototype Camel out of the erecting shed onto the Brooklands airfield for its initial test flight. Its contemporary British military aircraft were mostly known by letters and numerals: BE-2C, DH-2, FE-2B, RE-8, SE-5. And the official designation of the little fighter that Harry Hawker first flew on Friday, the 22nd of December 1916, was the, quote, Sopwith biplane F1, unquote. The Pup received its nickname from delighted pilots, and officials adopted it. Who named the Camel is now unknown, but it was a good name for an aeroplane whose behaviour was as unpredictable as that of the four-footed camel. And here's a point not many people are aware of. That draftsman, Ashfield, the bloke who actually did the drawings, translated Sopwith, Hawker and Sigrist's discussions, put them on paper, turned it into an aeroplane. During the 1930s, when England was allied with Japan, because Japan had been a World War I ally, he went out to Japan and he worked for a mob called Mitsubishi. And he spent about 3 years teaching the people at Mitsubishi how to build radial engined, low drag, lightweight, highly manoeuvrable, high performance fighter aircraft. And he actually worked on the design of the three predecessors to the Zero. So it's not actually drawing too long a bow to suggest that a Mitsubishi Zero is actually a retractable undercarriage, closed cockpit, monoplane, stressed skin Sopwith Camel. Because the bloke who did the drawings for the first Camel taught the Japanese how to build the Zero's precursors. Which brings me to the conclusion of Sopwith Camel Mystery, according to Norman Macmillan, which is the first in what I think is going to be a 4-part series, but who knows, I may spin it out to 5. Next in the series will be Camel, Ubiquitous Fighter. As twixt two equal armies, fate suspends uncertain victory. From the Ecstasy by John Donne. Warbles on a lot. To YouTube. Hope you're enjoying this. Ciao.